Twitchell's Book 1, Dwindling Magic. Written and read by T.D.L. White. Chapter 6. A Long Day. Nick needed to concentrate. With his mum chattering away in his ear, he scrutinised the screen while his fingers danced over the keyboard, pulling up as many logs and diagnostic reports as he could get to. At first he thought the worst. Someone had found out that he was using the computers at St. Mark's and pulled the plug. He tried to directly connect to a few of his gaming servers, and each time the connection failed. The update that he'd queued earlier had also failed. He was locked out of most of St. Mark's systems. He suddenly felt hot and shrugged his gown off onto the chair. If someone had found out about his little gaming server farm, he could be in big trouble. He glanced at the caretaker. She was looking right at him. Kinda creepy, but she couldn't have been involved. She was here, not in Luton. He spent a few more minutes frantically scrolling. Then he managed to end the conversation with his mum and noticed all of the messages on his phone. After skimming through a few hundred of them, he had pieced together what had happened and breathed a sigh of relief. It seemed like the school had gone through some kind of IT update. All of the library and computer room systems were out of action. And at the same time, they had changed the security settings on their perimeter firewall. That explained why he couldn't connect to them, and why no one else had been able to play any games. None of the messages mentioned the discovery of any illegal hacking activity, so he wasn't about to be arrested for misusing school property. But equally, he wasn't going to be able to collect money from gamers if he couldn't deliver a service. He checked the time. In 47 minutes, the caretaker would cut the connection, so whatever he was going to do, he had to act fast, and his options were limited. Either find a new way through the firewall and get his old servers up and running, or find some new computers to exploit. If he'd been back at home, it would be easy. He'd have been able to go to the library at break time and figure things out from the inside. Everything was easier when you had physical access to the network. Discovering a hole in the new firewall from the outside might prove to be impossible for him. He fired up a virtual machine on his laptop with a network scanner installed and set up a proxy to hide it behind. He pointed the scanner at the old school network and started scanning for vulnerabilities. While it did that, he put together a package of software to install, in the hope he'd be able to find and exploit a vulnerability while he still had internet access. There was nothing else for him to do now but wait and hope that his scanners found something that might let him back in. With a frustrated sigh, he checked his online payment account and transferred some credit to his mobile phone. He called his granddad, who picked up after one ring. "Hey, Grandad," he said.
"Nick, I missed you today. What happened?"
There was real concern in the old croaky voice, which made Nick feel even worse about not being there. Well, he hadn't thought about how to say this. "I'm at a new school, a boarding school somewhere in the countryside."
"A what? A boarding school? Oh, Nick, what did they get you for? Getting sent away is quite a punishment. What did you do? Steal a car?"
No, nothing like that. It's not even bad. Mum agreed to it, and it's a posh school, and I've got to wear fancy gowns, and the food's amazing, and they've moved me up a year. But I don't think I'm going to stay long."
"Why not? Sounds marvellous. Better than Borstal, anyway. Maybe you can sort me a place out there, especially if the food's good."
Nick smiled. "I need to get back home, so I can see you and Mum."
"Well, I can't speak for your mother, but I'm just fine, as long as you can visit in the holidays. You've already sorted me out more than I can thank you for, what with the food, shopping deliveries, and you even pay for my heating with that online account you set up."
That online account served both of them. It was how Nick collected money, and he wouldn't have been able to set it up without using his granddad's details. But it was true. Nick bought his granddad's weekly shopping and paid his bills. Most of the money Nick made went on making sure his granddad was okay. "But who will you talk to when you have your toast in the afternoon?" Nick said. "And it's bin day tomorrow."
"I can take the bin out. All you need to do is call me when you can. If I get really stuck, I'll speak to your mother."
Nick knew that was a lie. His mum and granddad hadn't spoken to each other for years, and the chances his granddad would ever ask her for help were slim to none. She knew that Nick visited the old man, but never asked about him. Nick wasn't even sure why they were upset with each other. Some strange pride stopped them from making up. It didn't make sense to him, but that was families. His granddad spent some more time talking to Nick about Twitchell's, mostly asking about the food. The distraction did a good job of keeping Nick's mind off his servers. For a short while. When the conversation ended, there was less than 15 minutes left of Wi-Fi time, and his scanner had found nothing. He had an idea. He'd managed to pull the logs from his log server, so he must still have access to that. But after a few minutes of attempting to connect directly and failing, he came to the conclusion that requesting logs was the only thing he could do. All other access was denied. The big old clock above the fireplace clicked round to 9 p.m. There were no results from the vulnerability scanner, and no more ideas from Nick himself. Right on the hour, the caretaker unplugged the wireless access point, and all communication was cut. Nick watched as she pushed the little panel in the skirting back down with her foot. The room went quiet for a moment before real-world chat gradually restarted. Nick sank down into the armchair and stared at his laptop. His phone buzzed, and for a moment he thought that there was a new data connection, but it was just a reminder. A reminder to order his granddad's weekly shop. He groaned. He'd completely forgotten to do it, and now he'd have to wait a whole day before putting the order in. What he really wanted to do was find another connection to the internet. But he was exhausted. He slid his laptop into his bag and trudged out of the common room. 4 more days until he could leave. Back in the dorm, his room was quiet and still. No sign of the roommate. He just wanted to lie down and sleep, so he gathered the uniform that still covered his bed and piled it all onto the desk on his side of the room. Then he took off his clothes and put them on top of the pile, leaving his boxer shorts on, and putting on the t-shirt that he'd been wearing when he arrived. He didn't own any pajamas or whatever you were supposed to wear. Only after turning the light off and getting into bed, a bed which was softer and nicer than his bed at home, did he remember to charge his phone and laptop. He turned the light back on and plugged them both in. There was a socket under his desk. The other desk had the semblance of use, but no actual signs that anyone had spent more than a minute sitting at it. Just a couple of blank sheets of paper on top, and that was it. He turned the room light back off and got back into bed. He lay back and listened. Nothing. In his flat, you could always hear stuff at night. Pipes gurgling, people walking in the flat above, cars outside with music thumping. But Twitchell's was silent. And with only the charging light of his mobile to keep him company, he drifted into a silent sleep. When he awoke, he found himself bathed in the grey light of early morning. Groaning, he rolled over and realized his previous night's mistake of not closing the curtains. The bed was comfortable, but he wanted his phone, so he slipped out of the covers and stood by his desk checking for any new messages. None. Yesterday's problems were still there, but he couldn't do anything about them now. The other bed was still empty, the bedclothes untouched. There was a towel hanging over a clothes rack next to his desk, but no toiletries. He took the towel and almost made it out of the room before remembering his ID badge. That would have been an embarrassing mistake. He found the showers and toilets at the end of the hall. The door was old and worn, but it had the same magnetic locking mechanism that the doors in the college had. The cubicles were clean and modern and had good privacy. Each shower had its own shampoo and shower gel, which were nicer than the pound shop ones his mum bought. And the shower was far better too. The water didn't dribble onto his head. It hit him with a force strong enough that he had to lean into it to keep his balance. It felt great. His mind wandered. What if he had left his ID badge in the room? He didn't know where to go to get a new one, and he didn't have a map of the college or the surrounding grounds. What had the inspector said again? Just ask any member of staff if you need anything. If he had intended to stay more than a week, he would have a load of things to ask about. But even for only a few days, he wanted a map. Back in his room, he got dressed into school uniform with his phone in his jacket pocket. He wasn't nearly ready to experience the liberation of giving up electronic devices during the day. He put his laptop in his bag, pulled on his gown, and left the room. Although he was hungry, he took a detour on the way to the dining hall. First, to try the door to the mysterious empty room that he'd seen Jenny enter. It was still as empty as it was the day before. After that, he walked to the front desk in the entrance of the college, carefully inspecting the skirting boards on the way. The receptionist smiled at him politely, looking sharp in a dark blue suit with faint vertical stripes. "Hi," Nick said. "Good morning," the receptionist said brightly. "I hope you had a great first day yesterday." "Yeah, I don't know if you're the right person to ask, but I need a map." "Of course. There's a version I can print for you now." The receptionist looked down at the screen. "Can you email it to me too?" Nick asked. The receptionist paused, and Nick took that as an opportunity to spell his email address out. A few keystrokes later, and the email was sent, though he wouldn't be able to check it until that evening. And then he was on his way to breakfast with a freshly printed map in his pocket. Jenny and James joined Nick while he was tucking into his third bacon sandwich. He had the map of the school out next to him and had marked off all the places he'd already checked for Wi-Fi. He'd also managed to drip some ketchup onto one of the polo fields. "Morning," Jenny said cheerfully, putting a bowl of some kind of yogurt and nuts and seeds down in front of her. James followed behind and said nothing. He had a plate of waffles covered in honey in one hand and a cup of hot chocolate in the other. Nick nodded at them while chewing on bacon. James looked over his food at the map. "Going anywhere nice?" he asked. "What are A block, B block and C block?" Nick said, sliding the map over with a greasy finger. "Doesn't say on here." "The executive suites," James said, then followed it up with, "dorms for the RIs." "RIs?" Jenny leaned in closer and spoke in a low voice. "Rich idiots. Though it's not fair to say they're all idiots. Some of them are nice." "Some," James said. "The house only has scholarship students staying in it. Anyone with the sort of money to pay to be here can afford an upgrade on accommodation. Is there better Wi-Fi in the other dorms?" "Same rules as far as I know." James scooped the corner of a honey-soaked waffle into his mouth and chewed it a few times. "It's actually a selling point of this place." "The bad Wi-Fi?" James added more waffle to his mouth and nodded. Jenny explained. "The lack of IT for the students. The more traditional approach to education, back to basics, is what a lot of the rich families want. You get used to it." She cast a quick look at James as she spoke the last few words, then quickly turned her attention to her yogurt. Nick still couldn't believe they put up with such a terrible lack of internet, but neither of them seemed bothered by it. He was thinking of asking about the empty room when Elf turned up with Cece. She didn't have any food, just a mug of something hot. She sat down next to Jenny. "Can someone take Cece until lunch?" she asked. "I've got games, And you know how Cece hates horses. I can take her. I could use the company, James said. Doesn't one of us need to be a guide for Nick? Jenny asked pointedly, looking at James. It's only his second day. I could do it, Elf said. I'm fine, Nick said quickly. The thought of embarrassing himself trying to ride a horse in front of Elf horrified him. I've got this. He held up the map. Elf sighed dramatically. And there I was, thinking you liked us. She drained her cup and stood up. See you at lunch. She spun, and her gown flicked out for a moment before dancing along behind her. Her gown isn't like the rest of ours, Nick said. You noticed, James said flatly. Elf customizes all her clothes, Jenny said. It's the only way she'll wear them. Nick felt a paw on his shin. The end of the sandwich on his plate had some bacon rind and ketchup inside. He looked at Jenny, who gave him a nod of approval, and he slipped the scrap to the awaiting dog. Come on, Cece, James said, getting up. I've got a couple of things to do before lessons. The table was down to just Nick and Jenny, and she was scraping the last of the seedy yogurt with her spoon. Are you all scholarship students? He asked. I mean, were you selected because of how clever you are? Was Elf? Jenny looked around before leaning toward him and answering quietly. It's best not to talk about why we're all here. But needless to say, if someone thinks you should be here, then you probably should be. Me, James, and Elf are in an interesting situation. She leaned back, breakfast complete. But she didn't leave. Something about the way she said interesting situation made Nick think of the stupid crow. I'm not here because I'm smart. He trailed off. Why was it so hard to talk about the stupid crow? He lowered his voice so that no one else could hear. I'm here because of a crow. It sounded much worse than when he'd said it to the inspector. There was no way that Jenny wasn't going to laugh at him. He felt his face getting hot, and the collar and tie weren't helping the matter. But she didn't laugh. She simply nodded slowly, lips pursed, eyes studying his face. Is that why you're here too? He asked hopefully. Because of the crow? She shook her head. We shouldn't talk about this here. I need to talk to James and Elf. She rose to leave. Nick realized he might have made a bad mistake. Don't tell them, please, he said, pulling at his collar to let some air in. About the crow, you don't need to. It doesn't matter anyway. I won't mention the crow, she said, but there are some things about us that it might be good for you to know. I want to check with the others, and we can work out a place to talk. After she left, Nick poured a glass of water and drank it quickly. He didn't know what he'd been doing, talking about the stupid crow. From now on, it would be best if he kept himself to himself. He didn't need any new friends anyway, and they certainly didn't need him around. But this was only partly true. They did need him. They just didn't know it yet. This podcast was brought to you by me, TDL White. I'll be reading a chapter a week until it's complete.